Good afternoon. Today is November 3rd. We have been looking at European cultures, drawing parallels between European and Japanese culture. Last week we looked at the gaps between Japanese and European culture, and very quickly, major differences are Europe is a continent with different peoples living side by side, very often in conflict. So it is a conflict, it's a negotiation culture, it is a culture that is used to warfare, where you have to stand up for yourself, otherwise you will be pushed off the continent. And Japan is a country, an island, stable, with people of the same racial background living together. It's much more about stability. It's much more about living together, finding common ground than Europe. Then we discussed the way of the basis of the philosophy, and I think there is a big parallel between Confucianism, which is the backbone of Japanese culture, and religion in Western culture. Both are basically prescribing some kind of a way to live, how to live well and become a good citizen, become a leader in Confucianism, versus how to be accepted by God into heaven. But in Europe, we next to this religion, we have philosophy, which is very much focused on finding the truth, which is not a way, but is actually a process of constantly questioning again, conflict, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, trying to falsify and get closer to the truth. So this is looking at the essence. So this is also a difference between Japanese and European culture. Then the fundamentals of this philosophy is argumentation, model thinking, logical deduction. So make abstraction of the reality. The complex three-dimensional reality. I call it three-dimensional, but it's actually multi-dimensional, maybe 4 or 5-dimensional. But okay, let's call it three-dimensional. Reality is in European culture, we have a tendency to flatten it, to make it two-dimensional, to make it simpler in order to make it easy understandable, to bring everybody on the same page. And once we have this model, we actually use this model as a representation of the reality, and we're looking at, okay, based on this model, how should we proceed in order to achieve our objectives. Usually the path that we choose is one of deduction, of induction, of following logical steps in getting from A to B, based on the model. In Japan, it's different. There is no tendency to actually flatten the reality from 3D to 2D. Usually 3D is being maintained, and the way to get closer to the truth is actually looking at this three-dimensional reality from all kinds of angles and directions. So that means that there can be parallel truths, for example. It's not necessary that there is a single truth. That is something that is impossible in Western logic, but it's possible in Japanese logic. If we understand this, we can easily understand how it can be very difficult, for example, in international negotiations, very difficult for these parties to get on the same page. It's difficult enough if you are in a Western culture to understand each other, especially something complex as the world around us. But if we even have different ways of thinking, different ways of reasoning, and different ways of getting to understand the complexities of reality, then we can easily understand that there is a very big gap between Western and European the way of thinking, and a very big gap to really truly understand each other. Another difference, conservatism, incremental thinking. Well, this has become even more, I think, more apparent, or this has become even stronger role after World War II, with the change in education. There's more and more focus on incremental thinking, on not not fundamentally changing things, but gradually improving and increasing. So the Kaizen thinking, it's rather conservative, and when we look at the other side, I think the America is the most, well, clear example in this case, where the role of the individual is very important. The individual is the hero. Everything starts with me, basically. I am the center of the world. It's more about okay, standing up, taking risk, aiming for change, and the people who take a risk are being rewarded. So that's another big difference. Then there is conformism. I think this is also part of being on an island, versus eccentricity, individualism. Managers, this also comes from, I think, maybe our experience with colonialism, where we need to manage an entire empire, and this has made us more into managers, whereas in Japan it's more about influencing, about pre-meetings, about not necessarily top-down management, but more about finding common ground, approval, getting to agree on a certain stand. So it's more about influencing than about managing, and putting your will on the on your followers. Japan is much more patient. Also, Confucianism is much more about patience. Western people are very tolerant towards impatience. Impatience is accepted. Explicit versus implicit. Language. There is we are very fortunate to have English as the global language, because it's much easier for Europeans to learn the English language than it is for the Japanese. So that is definitely a handicap for Japanese. And then a final difference was the person-to-person approach. In Europe, if we are talking about negotiations, then basically some individual takes the lead in the negotiations, and he will represent his organization, but it is this person that you are going to make an agreement with. So this is a person-to-person game, where the persons in that game can make concessions, can make can give something away, can come basically try to broker this deal. Whereas in Japan, it's more of organization to organization game, where the representative in the negotiation is merely representing the organization. Therefore, it's much harder for him to make concessions. You always need to look back and ask permission from the organization. So there are a lot of gaps. If we look at this, if we put these things side by side, we can easily see how hard it is for Japanese companies, for Japanese people to globalize. There is a different way of thinking. There is a different set of values. There is a language gap. So all these things contribute to a very big challenge when it comes to globalization. So what are we going to do about this? Well, how are we going to bridge this gap? Because, okay, saying that there is a gap, that's the first step. But then how are we going to bridge this gap? And that's the focus of today.